Have you ever opened an old conversation for no obvious reason? Maybe the person is still in your life. Maybe you haven't spoken in months. Maybe there's someone you used to love, someone you lost, or simply someone who once understood you at a very specific moment in your life. You scroll upward. You find the message. And even though you already know what it says, you read it again. Sometimes you smile. Sometimes you notice a sentence you somehow missed before. Sometimes you start analyzing the punctuation, the timing, the words they chose. And sometimes you close the conversation feeling worse than when you opened it. So why do people reread old messages? It would be easy to say that they simply can't let go. But psychology gives us a much more interesting answer. Because an old message isn't only information.
It can also become a memory cue, a piece of emotional evidence, a reminder of who you were, or even an attempt to resolve uncertainty that the conversation itself can no longer resolve. And once you understand those differences, you can ask a much better question than, why am I doing this again? You can ask, what am I hoping to find this time? Number 1, you may not be rereading the message. You may be revisiting the moment. Think about what happens when you find an old message that mattered to you. You don't experience it like a random paragraph. You remember where you were. You remember what was happening in your life. You may remember how you felt when their name appeared on your screen. A message can act almost like a doorway into autobiographical memory, our memory for personally experienced events. Research on autobiographical memory shows that memory and emotion are deeply connected. Emotional experiences influence what we remember, and our emotional state and goals when remembering can influence what we retrieve from the past. That's why 10 ordinary messages can disappear into history, while one sentence remains vivid years later. Imagine that during a difficult period of your life, someone wrote, "I believe in you." Today, those 4 words may look simple, but you are not only reading 4 words, you're remembering the version of yourself who needed them. You're remembering the person who sent them. You're remembering what that relationship meant at that time. The screen contains text. Your mind reconstructs a world around it. And that's the first important distinction. Sometimes we return to old words because they give us access to an old emotional world. Number 2, old messages can help us reconnect with an earlier version of ourselves. Autobiographical memory doesn't only help us remember events. Researchers have proposed that remembering the personal past serves several broader psychological functions, including guiding behavior, supporting social bonds, and maintaining a sense of continuity in who we are. That idea of self-continuity is especially interesting, because sometimes an old conversation isn't fascinating because of the other person. It's fascinating because of you. Look at messages you wrote 5 years ago, and you may barely recognize yourself. Maybe you were more hopeful, more insecure, more impulsive, more affectionate, more afraid. Maybe you tolerated things you wouldn't tolerate today. Or maybe you expressed feelings that you've become much more careful about expressing now. The conversation becomes a kind of accidental diary. Except, unlike a diary, it contains another person's reactions to you. You see yourself through interaction. You see what made you laugh, what made you worry, what you apologized for, what you wanted. And sometimes that creates a strange feeling. That really was me. This is one reason rereading the past doesn't automatically mean someone wants to return to it. You can revisit an old home without wanting to move back in. And you can revisit an old conversation because it helps you understand the distance between who you were and who you are now. Sometimes the message isn't preserving the relationship, it's preserving a chapter of your identity. Number 3, sometimes what you're looking for is connection. There is another reason old messages can feel unusually powerful. They are evidence that a moment of connection actually happened. Someone once noticed you. Someone responded. Someone laughed at your joke. Someone asked whether you got home safely. Someone told you something they didn't tell everyone else. And when that relationship changes or disappears, the messages remain. Research on nostalgia is useful here. Nostalgia isn't simply sadness about the past. Studies have associated nostalgic remembering with social connectedness, self-continuity, meaning, and, under some circumstances, improved positive affect.
Research also suggests nostalgia differs psychologically from simply brooding about the past. That's important because two people can open an old conversation for completely different reasons. One person reads it, smiles, remembers something meaningful, and returns to the present. Another person reads it, searches for another message, then another, and 3 minutes later feels trapped inside a relationship that no longer exists. The behavior looks identical from the outside, but psychologically, it may be doing something very different. One is remembering, the other may be searching. And that leads us to the most important part. Number 4, rereading can become an attempt to solve uncertainty. You've probably experienced this with a confusing conversation.
Someone wrote, "It's fine," and suddenly your mind becomes a detective. Was it actually fine? Were they angry? Why no emoji? Why did they take 3 hours to answer? Why did they say okay instead of course? So you read the conversation again, not because you've forgotten it, because you want certainty. Research on checking behavior shows that uncertainty can motivate repeated checking, although much of this evidence comes from anxiety and obsessive-compulsive related paradigms and should not be casually turned into a diagnosis of ordinary texting behavior. Still, the underlying idea is useful. Checking can temporarily feel like progress because you are doing something. Maybe this time you'll notice the clue. Maybe this time the conversation will reveal what the other person really meant. But there is a problem. Old messages contain old information. Your interpretation can change. The evidence usually doesn't. So you can read the same sentence 10 times and produce 10 slightly different theories. This is where rereading stops being memory and starts becoming investigation. And investigation becomes exhausting when there is no new evidence to discover. If you've ever done this, try noticing the question underneath the behavior. Are you asking, what happened? Or are you actually asking, can I somehow become completely certain about what this person felt? Those are not the same question. And sometimes the second one has no answer hiding inside the chat history.
If this distinction is already making you think of a conversation you've revisited more than once, you can share in the comments what usually brings you back, the person, the memory, or an unanswered question. Number 5, your current emotion can change what you find in the past. Here's something else we often forget about memory. Remembering isn't exactly like playing a recording. Autobiographical memory is reconstructive, and emotion can influence both how experiences are remembered and what becomes accessible when we retrieve them. That means you may open the same conversation in 2 different emotional states and experience it differently. When you feel secure, you may read an old exchange and think, that was a beautiful moment. When you're lonely, the same exchange may become evidence of what you no longer have. When you're angry, you may suddenly notice every dismissive sentence. When you're questioning yourself, you may search for proof that you mattered. The words haven't changed, but the mind approaching them has. This doesn't mean your interpretation is false. It means interpretation happens from somewhere. Your present state accompanies you into the past. And that gives us a surprisingly practical question to ask before opening an old conversation. Why does this message feel important to me today? Not last year, not when it was sent, today. Maybe you're lonely. Maybe something reminded you of that person. Maybe you're trying to make a decision. Maybe you're missing who you were around them. Maybe you're looking for reassurance. That question can reveal more than another 20 minutes of scrolling. Number 6. The healthiest clue may be what happens after you reread. There's no psychological rule saying that rereading old messages is unhealthy. Personal memories can serve meaningful functions. They can support connection, identity, reflection, emotion regulation, and even help us use the past to navigate the present. But the effects depend on how memories are being used and on the person and situation. So instead of judging the behavior, observe its consequence. After rereading, do you feel warmer, clearer, grateful, more connected to your own story? Or do you feel more anxious, more confused, more compelled to check again, less able to return to your present life? That difference matters. Nostalgic reflection and repetitive brooding are not psychologically identical, even though both involve looking backward.
Research comparing these forms of past-oriented thought has found a more positive functional profile for nostalgia than for brooding. So the better question isn't, do I reread old messages? It's, what does rereading do to me? If it gives you perspective, warmth, or a clearer understanding of your own story, perhaps the conversation is functioning like an old photograph. You visit it, you remember, then you return.
But if every visit produces another question, another interpretation, another need to check, you may not actually be looking for a memory anymore. You may be asking the past to give you certainty, and the past is often very bad at doing that. Number 7, you don't necessarily need to delete the past to stop living inside it. There is a popular idea that moving forward requires deleting everything. Delete the messages, delete the photos, erase the contact, never look back. For some people, creating distance may genuinely be useful.
But psychologically, there is no universal rule that emotional growth requires erasing your history. A healthier goal can sometimes be simpler. Change your relationship with the archive. The messages can exist without becoming a place you repeatedly go to for reassurance. The memory can matter without controlling your attention. A relationship can have been real without needing to become your future. And an older version of you can deserve compassion without becoming someone you need to return to.
So the next time your thumb pauses over an old conversation, don't immediately tell yourself to stop. Notice what you're hoping will happen if you open it. Are you remembering? Are you reconnecting with part of your story? Are you enjoying a moment of nostalgia? Are you trying to understand something? Or are you hoping that one more reading will finally remove uncertainty that 10 previous readings couldn't remove? That distinction is far more useful than labeling yourself as someone who can't let go.
Because sometimes rereading an old message is simply remembering. Sometimes it's connection. Sometimes it's identity. Sometimes it's reassurance. And sometimes it's a question that the past can no longer answer. The messages may be exactly the same, but why you return to them can tell you something important about what you need in the present. And perhaps that's the real value of looking back. Not to keep living there, but to understand what keeps calling you back.